Welcome. We are really glad you've joined us today. If you're listening to this, you are likely someone who values a thorough, logical understanding of complex systems. You probably prefer the quiet clarity of structural analysis over the daily noise and emotional theater of standard political punditry.
Right.
And we are going to provide exactly that today. We are embarking on a deep dive into an entirely theoretical, highly meticulous redesign of state architecture. Our source material for this exploration is a comprehensive university lecture. Specifically, it's the second workshop in a series delivered by Professor Vozenjink titled Separation of Powers.
It is, it's a really profound piece of material to unpack. And to be entirely clear from the outset, our mission here is objective analysis. We are examining this lecture purely as a theoretical model of governance based on the provided slides and the accompanying audio transcript. We are not here to endorse any specific political viewpoints, parties, or ideologies that might be mentioned in the professor's examples. Instead, we are looking at the mechanics. We are analyzing the engineering of this proposed system, examining how the professor attempts to construct structural accountability from the ground up.
It is a fascinating exercise in taking apart the engine of government, basically laying all the pieces on the floor and asking how we can put this back together so it actually functions without breaking down under pressure. And to begin that process, we really need to understand the foundational philosophy behind this entirely new system, because he doesn't start with standard political science or history. He starts with an engineering methodology known as TIZ.
Right. TIZ is a Russian acronym that translates to the theory of inventive problem solving. It's a methodology originally developed by analyzing thousands of patents to understand how complex engineering problems are actually solved across entirely different industries. And the core principle the professor borrows from TIZ is this concept of the ideal final result. Well, when trying to design a complex system, you do not start from the current messy reality and try to incrementally guess your way forward. You start by envisioning the absolute ideal outcome, the perfect endgame, and then you map the steps backward to the present day.
The professor provides a highly accessible analogy for this, which I think is helpful. He talks about the chess grandmaster. When you watch a grandmaster play, they are not sitting there calculating every single exponential possibility of the next 50 moves moving forward. The math on that is just impossible for the human brain to process in real time.
No, you would be overwhelming.
Right. Instead, the grandmaster visualizes the final checkmate position first. They see the exact configuration of pieces required to trap the opponent's king, and then they work backward from that ideal final result to the current state of the board. That backward planning dictates their next immediate move.
That is an incredibly efficient way to cut through the noise of infinite variables. By defining the end state first, you eliminate millions of irrelevant pathways. But what is perhaps the most crucial axiom of this entire system, and the professor insists on this repeatedly, is his view of human nature. He states unequivocally that a functional system must not be built for ideal, benevolent people. It must be designed to withstand people at their absolute worst.
Let me push back on that a little because that sounds deeply cynical. Usually when we talk about democratic institutions, we talk about public service, duty, and electing good people to do the right thing. Isn't it a bit defeatist to design a government based on the assumption that everyone running it is inherently selfish or corrupt?
I mean, it might feel cynical emotionally, but from an engineering perspective, it is the only safe assumption. Think about civil engineering. If you build a suspension bridge, assuming the weather will always be sunny, the wind will always be a gentle breeze, and the traffic will always be light.
That bridge is going to collapse during the first winter storm.
Exactly. The professor argues that political systems are exactly the same. If a system relies on the assumption that politicians will simply be good, or that people will naturally put the community above their own interests, that system has zero structural integrity. It must be able to function under maximum stress with the most self-interested, greedy, and partisan individuals at the helm.
Okay, that makes sense. You engineer for the maximum load limit, not the everyday average. And this leads directly into the professor's critique of our current political reality. Because when you look at modern governance through this skeptical engineering lens, the flaws in the current blueprint become glaringly obvious.
They do. And the lecture contains a rather blunt critique of standard modern constitutions. The professor actually refers to the current constitutional document in his region as just a rag. He doesn't use that term lightly to be provocative. He uses it because, in his analysis, the practical daily application of the document completely contradicts its written foundational principles.
The contradiction he focuses on centers entirely on the concept of the separation of powers. We are all taught this in civics class. In theory, and often in the very first few articles of any constitution, it is stated that the executive, legislative, and judicial branches are distinct, separate entities that provide checks and balances upon one another.
Yes, that is the theory.
But the lecture points out the structural reality. If you read further down into those same constitutions, you find that the parliament, the legislative branch, usually elects the government, which is the executive. The parliament also elects the judges, and they elect the individuals leading the control entities or oversight bodies.
Precisely. So the separation is essentially a myth on paper. The professor uses a very specific, evocative image from the source material to illustrate this. He describes a parliament that simply votes on a bell.
Let's unpack what that actually looks like in practice. He is describing a scenario where the ruling party, which controls the executive branch, signals to its parliamentary majority, literally ringing a bell in the chamber, to rubber stamp executive orders or appointments. If the ruling party controls the parliament, and the parliament appoints absolutely everyone else in the state apparatus, then the separation of powers is fundamentally an illusion.
There are no checks. There are no balances. There is just a singular chain of command disguised as democracy. It is a sobering analysis of how parliamentary majorities can effectively dismantle constitutional safeguards without ever technically breaking the law. When the executive branch essentially dictates to the legislative branch, who then appoints the judicial branch, the entire architecture is compromised. The system is entirely vulnerable to the natural human flaws we discussed earlier: greed, ambition, and partisanship.
So having diagnosed this structural illusion, the professor introduces his solutions. And the first mechanism he proposes to fix this vulnerability is perhaps the most aggressive. He decides to take human greed and weaponize it for the benefit of the state.
This brings us to what we can call the anti-corruption equation, and it relies on an extreme, mathematically rigorous application of the carrot and the stick. Let's look at this radical proposal for fighting corruption through built-in incentives. We will start with the carrot because it is substantial. The professor proposes massive, undeniable salaries for elected officials. The president, for example, would earn 20 times the average national salary. Key ministers, those handling defense, foreign affairs, or health, would earn 17 times the national average.
To put that in perspective for you, if the average citizen is living a standard middle-class life, the president and top ministers are elevated to a level of extreme institutionalized wealth. They are instantly placed into the top fraction of a percent of earners in the country. 20 times the national average is a staggering number. I have to imagine that would immediately outrage the average taxpayer.
It absolutely would, initially.
People already heavily scrutinize the salaries of public officials, and there is often a push to lower them to prove the politician is a man of the people. How on earth does the professor justify institutionalizing that kind of wealth using public funds?
He justifies it through cold economic calculus. The cost of paying a few hundred top officials a massive salary is an absolute drop in the bucket compared to the billions of dollars lost annually to systemic corruption, rigged public procurement contracts, and inefficient, politically motivated infrastructure projects. But this wealth is not a reward for winning an election. It is a calculation designed to change behavior. In exchange for this massive salary, there is a total absolute ban on any other sources of income.
So no side hustles at all?
None. The official cannot consult, they cannot hold corporate board seats, they cannot receive speaking fees, they cannot write a lucrative memoir while in office. The only exception is dividends from property or businesses they legitimately owned and declared long before taking office. The engineering goal here is to make the legitimate job so incredibly lucrative that stealing a bribe becomes mathematically illogical.
It eliminates the standard excuse of needing to secure their financial future after leaving public service. The state secures it for them abundantly. But let's be realistic, greedy people often just want more. A billionaire mindset isn't satisfied just because you gave them a nice salary. If someone is fundamentally corrupt, they might take the 20 times salary and still accept a briefcase full of cash for a construction permit.
And that is exactly why the carrot is paired with a disproportionately heavy stick. The stick in this system is severe, and it is designed to completely eradicate that risk-reward calculation. If an official is caught stealing even a single cent, the punishment is not a lengthy trial resulting in an expensive, taxpayer-funded stay in a comfortable white-collar prison.
Right.
The punishment is the total, immediate confiscation of all property from the official and, crucially, their entire extended family.
The inclusion of the extended family is what makes this truly radical. You are legally tying the consequences of corruption to people who did not commit the crime. If a minister skims off the top of an infrastructure contract, their sibling loses their house, their spouse loses their savings. How does the engineering logic justify punishing the family?
Because the professor recognizes how corrupt wealth is actually hidden. It is rarely kept in a bank account with the politician's name on it. It is transferred to spouses, it is hidden in trusts for their children, or it is managed by siblings or cousins. By legally linking the extended family to the punishment, the system creates a network of highly motivated internal auditors.
You are effectively deputizing the official's mother-in-law as a state anti-corruption agent.
Exactly. If a minister's spouse or sibling knows they will lose their own home, their own business, and their own savings, if the minister accepts a bribe, they become the strongest deterrent against that corruption. Nobody is a harsher critic or a closer observer than your own family when their entire livelihood is on the line. It makes the social and familial cost of corruption utterly unbearable for the politician. They aren't just risking their own freedom, they are risking the destruction of their entire bloodline's financial security.
And the source material provides a very vivid, almost brutal description of the forced relocation aspect of this punishment. The corrupt official and their family are not just left on the street to figure things out, they are actively sent to a bare minimum homeless shelter managed by the state. The professor specifically describes these shelters as repurposed former military barracks. They are provided with a moldy bed and a squat toilet. They only have the right to sleep there from the evening until the early morning.
Yes, during the day, they are forced to leave the barracks and find basic, menial labor just to feed themselves and pay the state for that minimal shelter. It is a complete and total fall from grace.
It's designed to be viscerally terrifying. Think about the psychological impact of that on a person driven by ego. The corruption we see at the highest levels is rarely about needing money for survival. It is driven by a desire for status, luxury, and superiority. This penalty strips away not just the stolen wealth, but all dignity, comfort, and social standing.
To enforce this extreme standard, the professor introduces a newly proposed legal code titled Crime Against Democracy. This goes far beyond standard financial theft, bribery, or embezzlement. It is a structural defense mechanism against authoritarian creep.
Right, the crime against democracy strictly penalizes the abuse of power itself. It specifically targets the building of a cult of personality. If an official begins utilizing state resources to demand adulation, if they start plastering their face on public projects or attempting to circumvent democratic processes to consolidate personal power, they are subject to a 15-year sentence. And that is alongside the total property confiscation and forced relocation of their family we just discussed.
Having established this rigorous framework for individual accountability, this extreme balancing of immense financial reward against total multi-generational ruin, the system then applies this philosophy to the very top of the government hierarchy. We need to look at how the executive branch operates under these conditions and what the professor refers to as built-in opposition.
The executive branch in this model is significantly streamlined. The president acts as both the head of state and the prime minister. The professor points out that in the current flawed system, you often have a dynamic where the president takes all the credit for national successes, cutting ribbons and giving grand speeches, while a separate prime minister absorbs all the blame for the daily failures of the government. By combining these roles into one office, the accountability rests squarely on one set of shoulders. There is nowhere to hide, and there is no subordinate to throw under the bus.
But the truly ingenious mechanic here, and perhaps my favorite piece of engineering in the entire lecture, is how the system handles the runner-up in the presidential election. In most current democracies, the person who comes in second gives a polite concession speech and essentially goes home. Or they spend the next 4 years complaining from the sidelines on television without any actual power to intervene in the government. In this proposed architecture, the runner-up automatically becomes the supreme state controller.
This acts as a formalized fourth branch of government. In engineering terms, this is a literal sensor placed inside the machine. The Supreme State Controller's entire job, their constitutional mandate, is to audit and monitor the executive branch.
Which guarantees that the person overseeing the government is highly motivated to find flaws.
Let me stop you there, because the immediate counterargument seems obvious. If the person who just lost a bitter, hard-fought election is given the power to audit the winner, doesn't that just create total gridlock? If the runner-up's only goal is to destroy the president to set themselves up for the next election, how does any infrastructure get built? How does any budget actually get passed?
It is a vital question. The key is that the Supreme State Controller does not have veto power over policy decisions. They cannot stop the president from building a highway just because they disagree with where the highway is going. Their power is strictly auditive and legal. They have unlimited access to all state documents, financial ledgers, and internal communications, and they have the power to bring cases directly before the courts if they find irregularities. They audit legality and process, not policy preference.
Ah, I see. So it institutionalizes a permanent negative feedback loop based on legal compliance. The executive knows that their most bitter political rival is constantly looking over their shoulder, reading every single contract, with full legal authority to prosecute them if they step an inch out of line.
Exactly. It removes trust from the equation entirely. You do not have to hope that a government-appointed auditing body will do its job impartially, because you have engineered a situation where it is in the auditor's direct, self-interested political ambition to be as thorough and unyielding as possible. You are using the runner-up's ambition to keep the winner honest.
That is brilliant. And this same logic of forcing accountability mechanically is applied to the election process itself through a mechanism the professor calls the yes-no matrix.
This completely changes the nature of political campaigning. Currently, candidates often give vague, sweeping speeches about hope, progress, or returning to traditional values. They offer platforms that are intentionally ambiguous so they can pivot once in office.
But under the yes-no matrix, the presidential candidate must answer 10 binary questions posed by the upper chamber of the legislature during the campaign. For example, will we join the European Union? Or will we enact these specific economic sanctions against this specific country? Or will we nationalize the energy sector? The candidate must answer with a definitive yes or no. There is no room for nuance, no, we will study the issue, and no dodging the question.
And the weight of those answers is absolute. According to the lecture, these 10 answers legally become part of the Constitution for the next 4 years of that president's term. If a candidate says yes to joining the EU, that becomes a constitutional mandate.
So what happens if the geopolitical landscape shifts dramatically? Let's say a candidate says yes to a trade deal, but 2 years into their term, that trading partner undergoes a violent revolution. The president cannot simply change their mind due to shifting poll numbers or sudden international pressure.
No, they cannot unilaterally pivot. Changing a yes answer to a no midterm requires a national referendum. The president has to go back to the public and officially ask for permission to break their binding campaign promise.
It completely eliminates the empty campaign promise. You cannot tell one demographic what they want to hear in a swing district and then do the exact opposite once you actually hold power, because your campaign promises are literally legally binding text in the Constitution. It forces a level of honesty on the campaign trail that is currently unheard of. You have to be certain of your platform because you are legally shackled to it.
It is a mechanical solution to a behavioral problem. We cannot make politicians inherently honest, but we can make the cost of lying mechanically prohibitive. Now, having explored how the executive leadership operates under these strictures, we must look at how the everyday citizens are actually represented in this system. How do the people interact with this architecture? This brings us to the legislative branch, and specifically, the concept of interest communities.
The proposed legislative body consists of a 250-seat parliament, but it is split exactly in half. 125 seats are geographical, representing specific regions, cities, and districts, just like almost every parliament or Congress today. But the other 125 seats are allocated to what the professor calls political interest communities.
The source material provides several distinct examples of these communities to illustrate the concept. They could be a union of pensioners, an association of healthcare workers, educators, tech innovators, agricultural workers, or even patients advocating for the treatment of specific terminal illnesses. The structure acknowledges a modern reality. A citizen's daily life, their economic struggles, and their priorities are often defined much more by their occupation or their life circumstances than by their geographical location.
Let's explore the hypothetical of how that actually works for a voter. Let's say you are a software engineer living in Austin, Texas. Under a purely geographic system, your representative has to balance your needs with the needs of the ranchers outside the city, the local restaurant owners, and the retirees in the suburbs. It is a diluted representation. But under this dual system, your daily needs, your economic concerns regarding data privacy laws, and your vision for AI regulation probably align much more closely with another software engineer living in Silicon Valley than they do with the person who happens to live in the house next door to you.
Precisely. This system shifts the paradigm of representation to reflect that interconnected reality. The mechanics of implementing this are quite modern. Citizens would use a secure smart ID to electronically register for a specific interest group prior to an election. You get your geographic vote based on where you live, and you get your interest community vote based on your registered affiliation.
How does that change the reality of political campaigning? Because right now, so much of legislative campaigning relies on regional tribalism. I am going to fight for our state, or I am going to bring federal money back to our district. If you are running for an interest community seat, that rhetoric is useless.
It forces specificity. Politicians vying for the interest community seats cannot rely on broad generalities or local patronage. If you are running to represent the national community of healthcare workers, you cannot just say, "I support hospitals." You have to present deeply detailed policies on medical supply chain logistics, nurse-to-patient ratio regulations, or shifts in insurance coding protocols. You're speaking to a constituency that is highly educated in that specific field and deeply invested in the outcome.
It elevates the political discourse from vague emotional appeals to actionable technical specifics. If you try to feed a union of tech innovators empty political slogans, they will vote for the candidate who actually understands API regulations. It is a fascinating way to ensure that the parliament has actual lived expertise embedded in its ranks rather than just professional politicians.
However, a parliament composed of highly specialized, potentially aggressive interest groups could risk becoming volatile. A union of educators and the union of taxpayers might have fundamentally opposing mandates, leading to severe friction. To counteract this volatility, the architecture requires a stabilizing force. This brings us to the upper chambers, the Senate, and more uniquely, the Senate Council.
The regular Senate is composed of experienced politicians who act as a filter, confirming or sending back the laws passed by the lower house. But the truly unique element the professor introduces is the Senate Council, or the Senatsky Sovet. This council is composed of the absolute institutional memory of the state. It includes retired presidents, former Supreme State controllers, and senators who have served 4 full terms, which amounts to 16 years of high-level legislative experience.
These are individuals who have spent decades navigating the complexities of statecraft, international diplomacy, and legislative compromise. They have seen regimes come and go. The mechanics of their compensation and their power within this council are very carefully balanced. First, they are paid 30 to 40 times the average national salary, and they receive this massive compensation for life.
Wait, 30 to 40 times the average salary for life? We just discussed the president getting 20 times, and that was already shocking. Why do retired politicians who are essentially serving in an advisory or elder capacity get paid double what the active executive gets? What do they even do to earn that kind of institutionalized wealth?
They are paid that much specifically to ensure they never need to do anything else. This extreme compensation is designed to render them completely impervious to financial bribery, corporate lobbying, or the need to secure a lucrative private sector job after their service. Their financial security is absolute and unquestionable. Furthermore, they possess formidable power to justify this position. They have the constitutional authority to veto decisions made by the president or by powerful mayors, provided they reach a 2/3 majority within the council.
They can override the active executive. But the source material outlines what we can essentially call the Jedi restrictions attached to this wealth and power. There is a massive catch. In exchange for this lifelong financial security and this immense veto authority, these individuals are strictly forbidden from joining any political parties. They're also entirely banned from giving political interviews to the media.
Yes, they cannot campaign for anyone, they cannot endorse political candidates, they cannot write op-eds supporting a specific piece of legislation, and they cannot participate in the daily partisan political circus.
It reminds me a bit of the historical concept of the Roman Senate in its most idealized form, or even taking monastic vows, except instead of a vow of poverty, it is a vow of extreme wealth in exchange for your silence in the public square.
That is a very apt analogy. They operate as a silent, stabilizing, nonpartisan force. By removing their ability to seek further political advancement, public adulation, or financial gain, the system attempts to distill their decades of hard-won experience into pure objective judgment. They act as a true council of elders. Their sole purpose is to observe the machinery of the state and step in only to ensure the government does not veer into dangerous extremes or violate its foundational constitutional principles. You are buying absolute neutrality.
It is a fascinating concept, buying neutrality by satisfying every conceivable material need and severing all avenues for further ambition. And this intense focus on neutralizing human bias brings us to the final and perhaps the most radical component of the professor's architecture. We need to look at his method for removing political influence from the one branch that absolutely must remain objective, the judiciary.
The primary goal here is to create a truly independent judiciary, completely free from the legislative rubber stamp process we analyzed at the very beginning of our deep dive. If the parliament simply appoints the judges based on a majority vote, the judges are inherently beholden to the political party that gave them the job. To break this chain of patronage, the professor proposes a mechanical filtration mechanism called iterative consensus.
We need to walk through this exhaustive filtration process step by step to understand the rigor of the engineering here. Let us imagine a seat opens on the Supreme Court. The process begins with the Supreme Court itself proposing 15 highly qualified candidates, and they do this based on objective metrics: the judges' overturn rate on appeal, the speed at which they clear their docket, and their academic contribution to legal precedent.
Exactly. The judiciary itself creates the initial pool of 15, ensuring baseline competence. From those 15, the legislative branch must narrow the list down to 13.
Why the legislative branch next?
Because the legislature represents the current popular will of the people. They get the first cut to remove the two candidates who might be brilliant legal minds, but are perhaps deeply unpalatable to the general public for various ideological reasons. But they only get to cut two. Then, the High Judicial Council steps in and reduces the list from 13 down to 11.
So the professional peers step back in to remove candidates who might be popular with the politicians but are legally weak. Then the Senate takes the list of 11 and cuts it to 9.
The experienced politicians filtering out any remaining populists. Following that, the Constitutional Court narrows the list from 9 to 7. This ensures the remaining candidates have a track record of strictly adhering to the Constitution over pure, momentary legislative statute.
Then the Supreme State Controller, the election runner-up we discussed earlier, brings the list from 7 down to 5.
The ultimate skeptic gets a say. The controller will look at those 7 and immediately strike the 2 candidates who seem overly friendly with the current executive branch.
And then the Senate Council, our Jedi elders, reduces the list from 5 to 3. Why do they get this specific slot in the sequence?
Because they are the neutral observers. By the time the list reaches them, the overt partisans have been stripped away. The elders look at the remaining 5 and use their decades of experience to remove any hidden biases, leaving only the 3 most objectively qualified, neutral candidates. And finally, the president narrows the list from 3 down to just 2 candidates.
It is an absolute gauntlet. Every single branch of government, representing differing political interests, varying timelines of experience, and opposing oversight functions, has a chance to systematically strip away candidates they believe are too biased or unqualified. By the time you get to the final 2, they have survived an incredible stress test. But it is the final step that is truly radical. After all that filtration, when only 2 candidates remain, the final judge is not chosen by the president. They are not confirmed by a dramatic vote in the parliament. The final judge is chosen by a literal dice roll on live television.
The source refers to this practice as rev. The 2 remaining candidates literally roll dice in a broadcasted event. The rules are simple. If the sum of the dice is an odd number, the younger candidate gets the Supreme Court seat. If the sum is an even number, the older candidate gets it. It is an intentional, structural surrender to pure chance.
I can imagine people hearing that and thinking it sounds insane. You are letting mathematical chance decide a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land. Let's explore the game theory of why you would ever want randomness inserted into such a serious process.
You insert randomness specifically to sever the final link of patronage. Consider the psychological impact of this on the newly appointed judge. Because their final appointment was decided by the mathematical probability of a dice roll, they owe absolutely 0 political favors to anyone.
That is the key. The president cannot call them up a year later and say, "Remember, I put you on the bench. I need a favor on this ruling." The parliament cannot claim the judge owes them loyalty. The judge knows they survived the grueling filtration process entirely on their own merit and objective record, and they achieved the final seat by pure, unadulterated chance.
Their allegiance is mathematically and psychologically forced to remain solely with the law itself. They don't have a political patron to please because a pair of dice cannot ask for favors. It is a brilliant application of game theory to institutional design. It acknowledges that human bias is impossible to eliminate through goodwill, oaths, or promises alone, so it uses probability as an impenetrable wall against political debt.
It truly pulls all the threads of this deep dive together. This proposed architecture of accountability systematically removes trust from the equation of governance. It assumes people will be greedy, it assumes they will be fiercely partisan, and it builds mechanical, ungameable walls to neutralize those exact human flaws. You have the massive salaries weighed against total, multi-generational ruin and homelessness to combat grade. You have built-in opponents acting as permanent auditors with legal teeth to combat executive overreach. You have binding, binary campaign promises to combat political deception. And you have dice rolls ensuring absolute judicial independence.
It is a relentless structural approach to human fallibility. It asks us to look clearly at the failures of current systems, which rely far too heavily on the assumption of honor and unwritten norms, and to consider what a system actually designed for the reality of human behavior might look like. It's a triumph of engineering over wishful thinking.
And as we conclude, we want to ask you to reflect on the systems governing your own life. We so often accept that this is just the way things are, whether in our national governments, our local municipalities, or even the corporate structures in our workplaces. We assume corruption and inefficiency are just the cost of doing business with human beings. But this deep dive proves that entirely different mechanical structures can be imagined if we are willing to step back and rethink the very foundations of accountability.
It encourages a critical examination of the incentives driving behavior in any organization. If the rules are designed well, if the constraints are mathematically sound, the outcomes will be stable, even when the individuals operating within the system are deeply flawed. You don't need perfect people to have a perfect system.
Exactly. And we will leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We've spent this time discussing these concepts at the macro level of state architecture, but imagine applying this specific brand of relentless structural accountability to the everyday institutions you interact with. What if the extreme carrot and stick or the binary yes-no matrix were applied to the corporate world? What if a CEO's entire extended family wealth was tied to their ethical conduct regarding environmental regulations? What if the leadership of your local school board or your neighborhood association was subjected to an auditing process led permanently by their biggest detractors? How drastically would the behavior of leadership change overnight if the system simply stopped asking them to be good and instead mechanically forced them to be accountable? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.